All right, so in this session, we want to make further progress on operational risk. Operational risk is a huge risk. It says it covers everything that can go wrong except for the categories you've already covered, like price risk and liquidity risk. But operational risk can certainly cause those other ones. We're seeing that with the coronavirus. Definitely operational risk. Firms are shutting down. They're seeing their revenues disappear. Stock market's crashing. Bond market, corporate bond market is crashing. It's a huge risk. So how do we handle this? And so I want to cover a few articles on this related to planning. We know things like this are going to happen. How do we, in advance, prepare ourselves for these type of scenarios? We're going to talk quite a bit about this with Douglas Hubbard. There's a video of his I want you to watch, and I'll give it in a later class. One of the great thinkers in risk management. But here it's just the idea of planning involves forecasting, and we are very bad at forecasting. There's a group of articles out there. It's on Blackboard talking about, well, you can just see it, forecasting decision-making articles. There's several of them in there, and they're highlighted, so you don't have to read all of them. But the first couple of articles talk about something as basic as planning for the Olympics. Now we know, talk about a operational risk. The Tokyo Olympics have had to delay the Olympics for an entire year. That's got to be a huge cost and huge risk to them. But they really have no choice. At this point, people are not going to buy plane tickets to go to Japan, even if the coronavirus is solved before the Olympics are supposed to begin. People have to start planning now. But just the planning for the Olympics. The British government had the Olympics a few years ago. Their original budget was $2.4 billion, and it had risen up to, or not dollars, but pounds, and it had risen to 9.4. That's a huge miss. So you say, wow, they were just really bad at this. Hopefully others were better at it. If you come down to the bottom of this article, it talks about organizers of big sporting events tend to overstate benefits, understate costs. They're bad at opportunity costs. So they say, hey, we're going to have this big sporting events, the Olympics, March Madness, whatever. And so we're going to have all these hundreds of thousands of people visit and spend all this money. But what they forget to offset is the people who are avoiding those parts of the town because of the large crowds, or people who avoid, maybe someone was going to visit Great Britain and do a vacation there, but then they said, you know what, the Olympics are there, let's skip the trip this year, we'll do it again next year, or we'll try it next year. And so they have people who actually avoid those places because of the Olympics. The Olympic infrastructure tends to break budgets quite dramatically. Every Olympiad since 1960 has gone over budget, and the average is 179%. How can we be that bad at planning? You would think we learn our lessons. What about Russia? Russia was probably one of the worst. The cost of the Olympics has quadrupled. So, we talk 175% over, they're 400% over, or at least 300% over. They weren't, went from 314 billion to 1.4 trillion rubles. Just huge numbers. So an estimated cost of 50 billion. These will be the most expensive games in history. Russia placed its bid in 2007 and proposed a $12 billion bid that was already more than any other country. Yeah, we see again 180%. They're now 500% over. And then Russia, you have corruption, so some of this is definitely making sure President Putin's friends were part of the mix from getting projects. The quality of the work is pretty patchy. I was at the Olympics in Athens in 2004, and they did get some really great new infrastructure, new athletic fields, and a new subway system. So there was some that they got that retained some value later on. So there wasn't just a cost and loss of money. Especially the subway was a huge benefit because their old subway was so bad. So the Olympics got them a new subway. But it's unlikely the the net present value of these Olympics is positive. So the stadiums tripling in cost. So how do we handle that? And so here's this article. Here's the link to it. I think it still works. It's a Harvard Business Review article. So why are we so bad at forecasting? The primary goal of forecasting is, and I absolutely believe this, I talk in some other classes, why do firms forecast? And I think it's a legitimate question, because I think a lot of firms forecast just because they think they're supposed to. No one ever steps back and asks, why are we doing this? I remember at UTSA, we did forecasts all the time, and you would ask someone, why are you forecasting? The answer is always to support decision making. And yet I never saw a forecast that was used to make a decision. I saw decisions made that were then reflected in the forecast, but it never went the other way around. The forecast never helped with decision making. It might have controlled our behavior a little bit, but even that, you give someone a budget that, here's your budget for the year, people were ignoring those almost completely. It was an enormous amount of time and cost, and it's to what purpose? Well, here I absolutely agree with him that the purpose of a forecast is for risk management. It is to identify a range of possibilities. It is not a point estimate. Your goal in forecasting is to figure out what is the upside, what is the downside, which means you should put some financial crisis into your forecast, some recessions, some high inflation. You should test different extreme scenarios. So he says the main purpose of a forecast is to map uncertainty. It should have some logic to it. It's not a trusting bystander, but a participant above all. So you need people to actually be looking at the forecast as a tool for understanding the future, including not just some point estimate, but the full range of possible futures. So what's a good forecast versus a bad forecast? And I'm going to temporarily stop this, and then we'll get back in that. I want to set up another article right before we do that. All right, so let's look at his rules for a good forecasting and in my opinion, for good risk management. And we're going to see this when we talk about Douglas Hubbard as well. His purpose of forecasting is to define your cone of uncertainty. A good forecast gives you a context that informs your intuition. So you're trying to find overlooked possibilities, unexamined assumptions. It narrows the decision space within you must exercise your intuition. So essentially what he's saying is, let's get it all down on paper. What do we know? What don't we know? How uncertain are we? And once we do that, we can now make decisions. We don't have to do this blindly. And Douglas Hubbard is a big believer in that. So you're trying to look at the possibility of a particular moment or event. The forecaster's job is to define the cone in a manner that helps the decision maker exercise strategic judgment. Most important is defining its breadth, which is a measure of overall uncertainties. So think in terms of a normal distribution. How wide are the tails? How uncertain are you? And Douglas Hubbard, when we look at his presentations, he's going to say your goal in spending money on information is to try to narrow in that distribution. Sorry, my cat just attacked my keyboard, so sorry, threw me off there. All right, so you're trying to define how uncertain you are by putting it down on paper, actually admitting ignorance, which is something we're not really good at that. If we draw the cone too narrowly, we're actually causing more problems than too broadly. We should not try to exude confidence and precision that we don't have. So uncertainty allows for opportunity. It also admits what your upside and downside can be and how uncertain you are. So you can narrow the cone over time as you get more information. Again, as Douglas Hubbard says, spend your money in the way that most effectively narrows that cone of uncertainty. I'm gonna skip that part. Tricky part about wild cards, those black swans you might call them, is acknowledge sufficiently outlandish possibilities without losing your audience. We've just saw this with oil prices, how quickly they dropped with the Saudi Arabia and Russia incident. If you had said that a few weeks before, people would just laughed you out of the room. So you'd be crazy. There's no way oil prices could drop back into the 20s again. But it happened, and we tend to not be nearly outlandish enough in our assumptions. So, like we abhor uncertainty. We feel like it makes us look stupid or ignorant because we don't want to admit how little we actually know. So we need to ask hard questions about whether a seeming wild card is in fact deserves to move closer to the center. Right now we're seeing that with the coronavirus. Things are happening now that we've never seen before. I don't know if you've noticed the weekly jobless claims the last couple of weeks, or last few weeks. I don't know when you'll actually be watching this video, but the record high was about 700,000 jobless claims. And yet the last 2 weeks we've seen 3 million and 6 million. We've dwarfed the previous record by tenfold. It's just amazing. In 2 weeks in a row, 10 million. We've never seen numbers like that before. And we'll see this more obviously when we talk about Taleb and his black swan idea. This idea that black swans happen, they're huge, they surprise us, and yet in our forecasting and our planning, we never put them in, even though they are the single most important thing in a forecast and single most important thing to risk management. Next thing he talks about is the S-curve. The S-curve is this opportunity curve where things are moving along slowly, and then suddenly out of nowhere you see this huge sharp rise up, a power law. So the change is slowly, and then suddenly you hit some inflection point, some tipping point, and suddenly it moves rapidly. I think we might see something like that with autonomous vehicles, where no one's buying them, no one's using them, and then suddenly, little by little, you start seeing a little bit more, and then suddenly you hit some tipping point where suddenly it's a huge new purchase. The art of forecasting is to identify the S curve as it begins to emerge well ahead of the inflection point. Start seeing it. Most people are ignoring it. It seems so immaterial, doesn't seem that important, and suddenly it happens. It might be Blockbuster not seeing what was going on with online digital with Netflix. Starting to see those things in advance. They seem so small, so unimportant, but if you iterate it out and you see that S curve, that sudden sharp rise, then you're going to be a much better risk manager. We usually miscalculate the speed. There's a tendency to overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term. We tend to say, wow, autonomous vehicles will be here in 2020 and they'll be dominating. People were saying that just a few years ago. Well, we've obviously missed that. And so now people are saying, well, that didn't happen, so it's never going to happen. So they underestimate the long term. So the left-hand part of that S-curve is much longer. The right-hand side happens a lot faster. But there's a quote, never mistake a clear view for a short distance. Just because you can see it's going to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen next year or next 2 years. You got laws and regulations, all kinds of things that have to happen to get these things in place, and it always takes longer than you think. But then once you get to some tipping point, boy, it happens fast. So we are by nature linear thinkers, and phenomena governed by the sudden exponential growth by power laws catch us by surprise time and again. Even if we notice the beginning of a change, we instinctively draw a straight line. You need to draw a much flatter curve that suddenly exponentially shoots up, and the hardest part is figuring out when is that inflection point. The third rule is embrace things that don't fit. The best way to be a forecaster is to find things that don't fit in your view of the future. What we tend to do is when we have a particular outlook, when things don't fit the outlook, we tend to discard them. And he's saying doing just the opposite. We dislike uncertainty. and we're so focused on what's going on right now, we tend to ignore these indicators that say something is changing. There's something unfamiliar going on. We tend to throw out the unfamiliar entirely. There may be some of that going on with the coronavirus. I like this one. Hold strong opinions weekly. You notice weekly is W-E-A-K-L-Y, not W-E-E-K-L-Y. Hold strong opinions. You should have strong opinions. You should state your opinion, put it out there, why you believe it, but be willing to drop it in a nanosecond if new information comes around. Never invest your ego in a forecast. It just doesn't make sense. So one of our biggest mistakes we make is to over-rely on one piece of seemingly strong information because it reinforces what we already think. That's kind of the confirmation bias. A lot of intellectually weak information is vastly more trustworthy than a point or two of strong information. Once researchers have gone through the long process of developing a hypothesis, they have a tendency to ignore any evidence that contradicts their conclusion. So you want to do the opposite. State your forecast, state what you believe, and then start actively looking for things that contradict it. So a good forecast is a process of strong opinions weakly held. If you must forecast, then forecast often and seek to prove yourself wrong. Don't invest your ego. Having a strong opinions, you can reach conclusions quickly, but if you hold them weakly, you can change your opinion once you get any contradicting information. The time period is important. Look back a long period of time. Go back to the Great Depression. And I know technology and markets and liquidity, and there's things that have really changed things, but going back, there are some great books. One of Warren Buffett's favorite books is a book on some traders from the 50s and 60s and some other businessmen and businesswomen and just some of the huge mistakes they made. And he loves that book because, boy, and I read it. Just the fact that it was one of his favorite books got me to read it. I need to add it to my reading list. But it's just very, very interesting because the lessons learned still apply today, the mistakes people made in the past. Yeah, the world's changing fast, but there are lessons back there. The recent past is rarely a reliable indicator of the future. So when you look back for parallels, always look back twice as far as you're looking to the forward, and I'm saying go back even further than that. I love this quote. Temptation is to use history the way a drunk uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. So don't have a forecast and go back and find history to support what you already believe. Go back in history and see, man, when did things not work out like this? When did this not make sense? When were we surprised out of the middle of nowhere? So, these are black swans. So we'll get into this when we talk about black swans, definitely. And then there are times when you should not forecast. Now, I think Doug Hubbard will disagree with this part of it, but he's going to say there's some times where there's so much uncertainty, creating a forecast just doesn't make sense. So there are moments when forecasting is comparatively easy, and there's other times where it's impossible. So when the cone broadens to a point where it's just better not to be a forecaster, but we'll see what Doug Hubbard has to say about that. Doug Hubbard says you should always put something down. Express in numbers your uncertainty, your ignorance. At least put it down on paper, and then don't take your forecast too seriously. So I think it's a good way to think about forecasting. I strongly encourage you. In your first jobs, forecasting is probably one of the things you'll be doing in one of your first jobs. Ask the question. Maybe you need to be there a few months before you ask it because you don't want to get fired immediately, and I don't want to be blamed for you getting fired. But at some point, you need to ask the question, why are we forecasting? If they say we are forecasting for decision making, I would challenge that. The answer you want to hear is we are forecasting in order to manage risk, which means you need to create multiple forecasts. The next article I'll do in the next session. I'm going to go through it more quickly. It's a much shorter one, but it's an article by Daniel Kahneman. And it's before you make that big decision, how do you avoid biases? And that's his whole focus here. So we'll start here on the next one. Sorry about I got a little distracted there because my cat jumped on my keyboard. So sorry on that part of it. Hopefully you got the sense of that previous article.